RSVP'd, as well as to the people in attendance. So for those of you who have not attended events, our speaker will speak, and at the end, you will have time to share your questions. You'll put them in the chat just to me, and I will pose them directly. I recommend you put your view on speaker view. That will make it easier for you to follow, but I will be controlling who you see on your screen. Okay, so without further ado, we have with us today Gilbert King. And at the end, I will give you an opportunity to unmute yourselves, show your appreciation, but not till the end, not till I say so. So Gilbert King is the author of 3 books, most recently Beneath the Ruthless Sun. His previous book, Devil in the Grove, was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for General Nonfiction of 2013. A New York Times bestseller, the book was also named runner-up for the Dayton Literary Peace Prize for Nonfiction and was a finalist for both the Chautauqua Prize and the Edgar Award. He has written about race, civil rights, and the death penalty for the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Atlantic. In 2018, he was awarded the Talbot Sandy Bellamberti Committee to Justice Award for the Innocence Project of Florida. He was also a 2019-2020 fellow at the New York Public Library's Dorothy and Louis B. Coleman Center for Scholars and Writers, and he lives in Brooklyn, New York, and is coming to us today from a hotel room in Gainesville. So welcome, everybody. I am going to now take myself away until the end and take it away, sir.
Oh, thank you very much. It's really nice to see you. Wow, it's a pretty big crowd I can see from the number of participants. I always wonder if like somebody has seen me before because I've traveled around Florida talking about these stories, but this one's a little different because I haven't done it in a while. And there's been a recent development, which I'll get to at the very end. And I haven't really spoken about it very much. So it'll be really interesting. You'll be among my first audiences to hear like the newest update and sort of the epilogue of this story. So I think it's really interesting to be able to talk about this, especially with people who are in Florida. I'm going to go through a slideshow. I'm going to give you a brief rundown of this case that I was working on for years and talk about some of the criminal justice angles and you know, it's an American history story. It's a story about race. It's about law. It's about Florida. I think if I walk you through a little bit of American history about what was happening briefly, it'll put a little bit of what was happening in Florida in context. So I'm going to share my screen now and show you my slideshow. And can everybody see that? Okay. So what I like to start out talking about is these iconic images that we've all come to know from the Jim Crow South. And these are the images that you see in textbooks that sort of define a lot of times what life was like. And I remember looking at these photographs while I was deep into my research and seeing these in textbooks and thinking to myself, wow, I'm writing about the same period of time. These are not the images that I would use to really describe what I was seeing in my research, like those separate water fountains, the separate entrances and this kind of segregation, this image of segregation. And I remember having this thought while I was deep in research, like these images almost make it look to someone who's totally new to this as if this period in American history was rude and impolite to African Americans. And those are the words that I would not use to describe what I was finding in my research. The words I would use to describe what I was finding was brutality and terrorism. And so it made me think that these images that we use to sort of describe life in the Jim Crow South were whitewashing history, and they were doing a great disservice to Americans by just sort of watering it down. And I think that's why it's so important to know these real stories, even though they're, these stories are not very pleasant sometimes, and they're brutal, but this is American history. And I think sometimes the narrative that we get is like, oh yes, America, we had the original sin of slavery, but then Abe Lincoln came along and fixed all that. And, then things weren't perfect for 100 years, but then Martin Luther came along, civil rights. And, there's 100 years between Reconstruction and Martin Luther King. And what happened in those 100 years? And those are the years that we sort of don't want to talk about because, after the Emancipation Proclamation and after Reconstruction, things took a turn with these Jim Crow laws. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. I start out the book Devil in the Grove. Chapter 1 is Thurgood Marshall shows up in Cincinnati, 1946, and he's there to get an award. It's the Spingarn Medal, which is given to the black person who has done the most for an African-American cause in that particular year. And you can see Thurgood Marshall over on the right, and he's sitting next to the reigning heavyweight champion of the world, Joe Louis, and the commander of the Tuskegee Air Guard or Airmen, Benjamin Davis. So these are three African-Americans in the prime of their lives, and they're there to celebrate Thurgood Marshall getting this award. And I think what's really interesting about this photograph, what sort of struck me about it is Thurgood Marshall is looking pretty thin in this photograph. I mean, if you see a lot of photographs of Thurgood Marshall, he's always pretty portly, and but in this particular image, he's thin, and it's really only this one time in his life. And I remember looking at it going, what was happening here? Why is Marshall looking, so dapper and thin in this picture? Well, it turns out he was working on a case in Columbia, Tennessee, a race riot case. And some Klansmen and some police were firing into Black-owned businesses and homes. And Thurgood Marshall, these men were all arrested, dozens of them. And Marshall went down to defend them and said they were defending their homes from a threat. And against all odds, even against what he thought would happen, he got them all acquitted. And after the trial, because there were no Black hotels they had to drive back to Nashville. So Marshall and his lawyers are driving back with a couple Black reporters, and there's a roadblock ahead on the highway, and it's police. And they basically grab Marshall, pull him out of the car, throw him into a police car, and take him down to Duck River. And Marshall is sitting in that car, sandwiched between, two deputies, and he sees a crowd of white men standing under a tree, and he realizes this is it. He's about to be lynched. And fortunately, the Black people in the other car that he was in followed behind, and they thought there might have been too many witnesses, so they decided not to go forward with whatever they were planning to do. But the reporters and the Black lawyers in that car believed that they were about to see Thurgood Marshall lynched. And so think about that. Here you have a future U.S. Supreme Court justice, and he's nearly lynched on the side of a river in Tennessee for practicing law. And so this was the environment that Thurgood Marshall was working in the post-war America, 1946. One of the other things that's really important to understand about the post-war America is that you had over 1 million African-American servicemen who, after their service abroad, were returning to the United States. Many of them were returning to the Jim Crow South. And many of them felt that they were treated better abroad in places like England, France, and Germany, and they had more freedom and more respect. And after their service, they were expected to slip quietly back into that second-class citizenship. And many of them resented it because they had their first taste of what life could be like in Europe and where they were treated differently. And now they were coming back to this country, and many of them believed that, we were fighting for our country. We were willing to die for this country, and now we're back to second-class citizenship. And so many of these Black servicemen continued to wear their uniforms when they returned to America as sort of a silent protest to say, like, I love America. I fought and was willing to die for this country, and I want to be treated better here. And what a lot of people don't realize is that in 1946, after World War II, there was a wave of soldier lynchings across the South. African-American servicemen lynched in their uniforms because that was seen as very provocative to come back and to sort of start demanding equality. And so in the summer of 1946, there was a wave of soldier lynchings. And Thurgood Marshall, and his lawyers, they were really helpless. What could they do? Because they couldn't force prosecution on this. So a lot of times they were just really urging community members to sort of act and to sort of stand up to this. And it was a very difficult position to be in. And you could see, this is the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund in 1946, 5 lawyers. And you have that right. The 2 women in the middle, they were not the secretaries or the paralegals. Thurgood Marshall actually hired 2 women lawyers to be on the LDF. That was pretty unusual. This was at a time where really New York and Washington, D.C. law firms were not really hiring women as attorneys. But Marshall had no problem with that because, his mother had an advanced degree from Columbia University. He went to school with women he knew were very competent. And, you can see Constance Baker Motley there to the right. She later described Thurgood Marshall as the first feminist of law because he was, hiring 40% of his staff as women. His interviews were quick, and he just realized that these were extraordinarily competent women. They went on to become federal judges, executives in the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, an ambassador to Ghana, and Thurgood Marshall became a U.S. Supreme Court justice. And I think what's really interesting about this photograph is this is sort of a dream team in effect. If you had an issue that was 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment law, and it was reaching the U.S. Supreme Court, there was no lawyers that you wanted besides these guys. Thurgood Marshall's record was impeccable before the U.S. Supreme Court. And this was sort of like a dream team. They were really the best and the brightest. They had many, many victories in landmark civil rights cases. And so that was the environment that Thurgood Marshall was really found himself in the post-war era. I would call it the pre-civil rights era. And a lot of times Thurgood Marshall would just get on trains by himself and go down to these southern courtrooms and argue death penalty cases. And that was pretty extraordinary because many of his colleagues would say, Thurgood, you can't keep doing this. This is so extraordinarily dangerous. You are irreplaceable to this burgeoning civil rights movement. We can't afford to lose you. You're too important. These cases could change the lives of millions of people. And Marshall was always adamant. He said, these cases matter. These death penalty cases save lives. And in many sense, he was like the last line of defense. If you didn't have Thurgood Marshall and his lawyers taking your case, your odds of appealing it to a higher level court were really limited. And that was always Marshall's aim. He always knew he was going to lose locally. His idea was to try and get it to a higher court, obviously the U.S. Supreme Court, which he considered a level playing field. And he felt that he would get justice in those higher courts because he felt the environments in the South were just too stacked against the defendants. One of the photographs that really haunted Marshall in his travels and in his dreams was a lynching that took place in South Florida. And Marshall said that, of all the images that he had seen as the director of the Legal Defense Fund that came across his desk, this was the one that really haunted him most. And he said, it wasn't the bullet holes. I've cropped it a little bit. It wasn't the rope cutting into the neck. It wasn't the bulging eyes. It wasn't the bullet holes. It was the faces of these young children who got dressed up in their Sunday best to come out and have their pictures taken behind a dangling corpse. And Marshall said that was what woke him up at night. Like someday his day would come. He was going to be lynched, and all the school children would come out and get dressed up and rejoice around his body. And Marshall said this image of this Florida lynching of a man named Reuben Stacy was the one that really haunted him in his dreams. So now that you know a little bit of the context of what was happening in America, I'll walk you through this case that I wrote about in Devil in the Grove, which begins with a young married couple, Norma and Willie Paget, who are married, quickly separated. There were rumors about Willie maybe committing some kind of domestic violence with Norma, and the families wanted them separated after only a few months of marriage. And so they did this, they separated, they stayed in the same neighborhood, but in July of 1949, they decided they were going to try and rekindle their relationship, and they picked up a bottle of whiskey, went out dancing, and their car sort of broke down on the side of a road on the way to a town called Okahumpka at 1 a.m. And we're not really sure exactly what happened, but what we do know is that the next morning, the Ku Klux Klan rolled into Lake County because Norma Paget had claimed that she had been abducted and sexually assaulted by four young black men. And so when these rumors got out, these were very explosive rumors, very similar to the themes of like To Kill a Mockingbird. And also in the Jim Crow South, you saw this a lot, Rosewood. It wasn't an uncommon theme. These charges of either sexual assault or inappropriate mingling with the like mixing of the sexes. It was extraordinarily dangerous, extraordinarily explosive. So when the Klan learned these news, they pulled into Groveland and started burning down the black homes. And you can see a photograph of Sheriff Willis McCall in the center there. He's with the prosecutor to the left, Jesse Hunter, and his deputy, James Yates. And they're surveying the damage of one of those black homes. What you find out later in the book, you're reading with the FBI reports, is that Sheriff Willis McCall wasn't just surveying the damage. He was there the night before, and he was leading the Klan and directing them into which homes to burn down. And so Willis McCall was complicit with the Klan and complicit with this violence in Lake County. Now, the violence got so bad that the National Guard had to be called in and to protect the citrus groves, the citrus workers, and the African American community. It was extraordinarily explosive at the time, and because there were mass exoduses of Blacks from other towns, that was seen by some of the white citrus barons as intolerable. They didn't want to lose their crop. They didn't want to pay the economic price for a mass exodus. So some of the wealthy white citrus owners were really calling out to the governor to send in the National Guard, because that's what they feared, a mass exodus and then having this labor shortage. You can see that 3 suspects were arrested for the sexual assault on Norma Paget. 3 young men to the left, you can see Walter Irvin. In the center, 16-year-old Charles Greenlee. And to the right is Sam Shepard. And to the far right, you can see Sheriff Willis McCall. And, this is right after the arrest. Sometimes people are referred to as the Groveland Four. Well, there was a 4th person, a suspect, but he saw what was happening with the Klan rolling in, and he just got out of town. Sheriff McCall put together a posse of more than 1,000 men, and they hunted down Ernest Thomas and shot him dead in the swamp. And so that's how they got down to 3 defendants. And these are the 3 defendants who would later go to trial. Shouldn't say later. It was a month after their arrest. They were basically taken into trial and facing the death penalty. The media right away was calling for, the Lake County tragedy, the supreme penalty, 4 electric chairs. There's a quote at the bottom, which is really a message from Sheriff Willis McCall to Thurgood Marshall. And it basically said, if outsiders seek to hamper justice, and what Willis McCall was basically saying was, don't you Black agitating Northern lawyers come down here and try to tell us about race and justice. We're going to do this by ourselves. You're only going to make it worse. We'll give them a fair trial, and then we'll send them to the electric chair. That was the message that Sheriff Willis McCall was trying to convey to Thurgood Marshall and his lawyers. And, fortunately, Thurgood Marshall didn't listen to the sheriff's legal advice. One of the things that's interesting was this is a still image from the movie To Kill a Mockingbird. You can see Gregory Peck as Atticus Finch, and he's cross-examining Mayella Ewell. And it's a very dramatic moment in the story and in the trial and the case. And I kept sort of waiting for that moment too, because here I have a very similar case, but Thurgood Marshall's the lawyer, and you have a young white accuser who takes the stand. And none of this ever developed in reality. And there's a reason for that. Thurgood Marshall was told that there's no way that either him or his Black lawyers can get up there in court and question the word of a white woman, question whether or not she's telling the truth. They said that was the quickest way to send your client to the electric chair. And so what Marshall was advised to have this trial in Lake County was to get a white lawyer, so that the white lawyer could do the delicate cross-examination.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what happened. They ended up hiring an attorney by the name of Alex Keeker, who was hired just to cross-examine the witnesses and do the more sensitive witnesses. And if you read the book and you read the transcript of the trial, it's really pales in comparison to what you might see today. Back then, they were very respectful, and they would say, no, we're not questioning that this happened. We're just questioning that maybe you didn't identify the right attackers. And so the defense is very, very cautious. And Marshall did that for a reason. He kind of knew he was going to lose the case. They just didn't want to inflame the jury, and they wanted to just prepare for an appeal. And so you don't really see these moments in courtroom where there's drama. It's just a whitewashing, manufactured evidence, perjury at every turn, and prosecutorial misconduct. And that's what you see instead. This photograph is really important to me. This is I'll explain what it is, and I think once you understand what this is, Life magazine was sent down the very next day after the Klan rolled in to sort of document what was happening in Lake County. And this young man on the left was a witness by the name of Lawrence Berthoff. He was the first person to see Norma Paget the next morning. She was walking on the road outside his cafe in a little town called Okahumpka. And if you know what's happening in this photograph, you'll understand that this is what white supremacy also looks like. And the reason for that is Lawrence Berthoff said that Norma Paget waited until I opened the door. She came in, she sat down, he made some coffee, they talked for 15 minutes. And she said she was basically just looking for her husband. She didn't say anything about, being sexually assaulted. And the prosecutor, who you can see in the foreground with his suspenders there, he's basically saying, no, Lawrence, that's not at all what happened. Don't you remember? You saw a girl out there with a ripped dress and she was screaming, help, help, I've been raped. Don't you remember, Lawrence? And Berthoff talks to his mother. He says, they want me to lie. They want me to say something that didn't happen. They're putting words in my mouth. And they're threatening to take away this cafe from their father. And you can see in the background, you can see the sheriff and the deputy, very dangerous men just glaring at this kid. They are used to getting their way. And that's how so many witnesses just perjured themselves and did what was really expected of them in the community, was to go along with this official story so that they could, convict 4 Black men and send them to the electric chair, 3 really. And so Berthoff stands up to that. And it's a really remarkable moment. It's not an easy thing to do in these communities, to stand up to this, especially if you know that the men glaring at you are not only law enforcement, they're also affiliated with the Klan. And they can make bad things happen in Lake County, and they've done it repeatedly. And so because Berthoff would not change his testimony, the prosecutor took him off the witness list and basically hid him from the defense. And so I think it's important to show, like, that's another side of white supremacy, where you have white people who are expected to go along with, these structures of white supremacy in order to support it. And it's Thurgood Marshall always made this point. He said, this is not good for white people either. They're going to compromise themselves, and they're going to be forced into these positions to perjure themselves and to support this. And it's not good for America. And he made that point repeatedly. But I think this important photograph really captures that in a way that you can sort of see in the moment. I won't go into the trial too much. I'll just tell you that the prosecution was very successful. The 2 older defendants in their early 20s, Sam Shepard and Walter Irvin, were convicted and sentenced to death. Charles Greenlee, because of his age, 16, he was given life in prison on a chain gang. And Marshall said, that's how you know when a Southern jury thinks your client was innocent, the defendant was innocent, they only get life. And so that was the way he sort of looked at these things. So Marshall naturally appealed this and got this all the way to the US Supreme Court. And I kind of love this photograph because you can sort of see everybody's pretty loose, they're smiling. This is before arguments begin. Marshall's well aware that they're going to win this case because he's aware that the Supreme Court has already ruled on the way the grand jury was selected, and it was done improperly in Lake County. And so they're very loose, and they go in and argue, and of course they win the case. Justice Robert Jackson actually writes the opinion, the majority opinion, overturning the verdict in Lake County. And he basically says, this case presents one of the best examples of one of the worst menaces to American justice. On those grounds, we overturn. And what he was saying was basically, forget about the way the grand jury was selected, forget about the change of venue. This entire trial was a travesty of justice. And he wanted to make a stronger opinion. He knew it was argued on the grand jury, but he wanted to go a little further. And he said that, and it overturned the verdict. And Well, you can imagine that, there were some people who were not very happy in Lake County about the Supreme Court's decision. One of them was the Sheriff Willis McCall. Sheriff Willis McCall starts out the story as kind of a hero. He prevents a lynching when the Klan shows up and demands the bodies of the 3 black men for a lynching. He says there's not going to be a lynching in this jail and in this county. I'll handle this. But after the Supreme Court decision, now he's answerable to his electorate, and his electorate wants justice, and they're angry. And so Sheriff Willis McCall has an idea. On the evening of their retrial, he decides to go up to Rayford State Prison by himself and pick up the 2 defendants who are going to stand trial, Walter Irvin and Sam Shepard. Because of Charles Greenlee's life sentence, Marshall advised him not to join the appeal, because back in those days, they could lose the appeal, and Greenlee could actually be sentenced again to death. And Marshall thought that because he was no longer a minor, it would not be a good idea to bring him into this case. So he had him wait on the side. So Willis McCall drives up to Rayford, picks up Sam Shepard and Walter Irvin, handcuffs them, and starts driving them back to Lake County. And then he takes a little detour. And the next thing we know, the 2 defendants, the Groveland boys, are laying in a ditch. To the left, you can see Sam Shepard. He's been shot 3 times, killed instantly. Walter Irvin was handcuffed to his best friend, Sam Shepard. He was also shot. But what's really interesting about this photograph is just about everything you see in this photograph is a lie. You can see Sheriff McCall's rumpled Stetson hat sitting on the hood. His clothes are disheveled. He's got a little blood trickling from his eye, and he's pacing back and forth once the witnesses and the press come to the scene. And he's saying, I hated to have to do it. They tried to escape. They went for my gun. They were going to kill me. It was either me or him. I hate to have to do it, but it was my only chance at survival. And one of the local photographers takes this photograph, and as soon as the flash fires, one of the witnesses says, hey, one of those boys just moved. And sure enough, Walter Irvin, who you can see on the right, was still alive. And so now they're in a situation where they have to call an ambulance. They do call an ambulance. The ambulance takes Sheriff McCall to the hospital because of his injuries. They have to wait another hour because no ambulances in Lake County will transport Black people. And so they have to call a Black funeral home and get a hearse. And the hearse comes and takes Sam Shepard to the morgue and takes Walter Irvin to the same hospital. And Walter Irvin is suddenly in that hospital. He's been shot 3 times, and he's regaining his consciousness. And there's word in the hospital that he's telling a very different story than the one Sheriff Willis McCall is telling. This is a photograph of Sam Shepard that the family had sent me. They said, you should have a good photograph of Sam Shepard wearing his military uniform, who was killed on that day in 1951. And there's Walter Irvin in the hospital. And you can see him laying there. He's got, a tube in his nose. And you can see Thurgood Marshall in the foreground. And there's stenographers there. The FBI is there. Reporters are there. Doctors are there. And Walter Irvin starts to tell this story about being transported back to Lake County, handcuffed to his best friend. And he said, the sheriff started wiggling the wheel. And he said, I think I got a flat. I'm pulling over. And he pulls over on this deserted road. And he comes around, he opens the door, and he says he shot Sammy 3 times, twice in the chest and once right in the head. And he goes, I didn't have anything to do. I was handcuffed to Sammy, so I couldn't go anywhere. And then he shot me twice, once in the chest and once in the side. And so we both fell out of the car. He threw us out. And he assumed that we were both dead. He goes, but I wasn't dead. I was just laying there bleeding, pretending to be dead. And then I heard Willis McCall get on the radio and say, call back to his deputy, Jimmy, I got him good. I got him good. Get back here. And the deputy's car came back to the scene. And as the deputy pulled up, Walter Irvin is just laying there trying to stay still. His eyes are closed. He can hear the car. He can hear the footsteps getting closer. And then he feels this light shining across his face, and he kind of opens his eyes. And he hears the deputy say, this one's still alive. And then the next thing he knows, he's staring down the barrel of a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson, and he sees a flash. and the third bullet goes right through his neck, clean through his neck, but it doesn't kill him. And so he says at that point, they go back to the car and they say, we got to make this look like an escape. And they start tearing Willis McCall's clothes. They, rumple up his hat. They break his glasses a little bit. They even pull hair out of Sheriff McCall's head and put it in Sam Shepard's hand. And they sort of orchestrate this, false narrative of what happened. And Marshall and his lawyers and the FBI are listening to this and cannot believe what they're hearing. But they also recognize that 5 bullets have been recovered, 3 from the body of Sam Shepard and 2 from the body of Walter Irvin. And so they're listening to this and they're thinking, well, Willis McCall has told us that they were always advancing and he was backing up while he was firing his gun. So because they recovered 5 bullets, they think, well, we're never going to find that 6th bullet if it went clean through Walter Irvin's as he was attacking. But they said, if Walter Irvin is telling the truth and he was laying on that ground when he was shot, they have an idea where that bullet might be. And so the FBI rushes back to the crime scene from the previous night, and they find like a circle of blood from the night before, which was where Walter Irvin was laying. And they take out a little shovel and they start digging under that blood spot. And 10 inches below the surface of the soil, they find a .38 caliber bullet directly underneath where Walter Irvin's neck would have been. At this point, the FBI is absolutely convinced with forensic evidence now that the sheriff and the deputy have committed murder and attempted murder. And they write up a damning report urging the U.S. attorney to prosecute the sheriff and the deputy. That U.S. attorney happened to also be a white supremacist. He was the U.S. attorney in Tampa by the name of Herb Phillips. And he was, a known segregationist. And he basically quashed this entire thing. And so this whole FBI report never saw the light of day. Thurgood Marshall and his lawyers never saw the reports. The official narrative was that Sheriff Willis McCall was defending himself. And that was what carried the day. The judge ruled that the coroner's jury was so thorough that there was no need to impanel a grand jury. And so McCall was cleared immediately. One of these, I was the first person to see these reports. I filed a Freedom of Information Act request and got the reports. And, the evidence is all right there, forensic, and it was never seen by anybody. And so they never had this proof, and Sheriff Willis McCall got away with this murder and attempted murder. One of the other things I talk about in this case, aside from, 2 of the defendants basically being killed by the sheriff and his posse, and himself, was that 4 people were killed in the middle of this trial. And nobody really knew about this Groveland case, to be honest with you. Everybody's heard of the Scottsboro Boys. That was 1931 in Alabama. It wasn't nearly as dangerous, didn't involve somebody like Thurgood Marshall. Defendants weren't being killed by law enforcement. This is a picture of Harry T. Moore. He was the executive secretary of the NAACP. And he was a very close friend of Thurgood Marshall's. And when Marshall was down here, he appointed Harry T. Moore to keep the pressure on Sheriff Willis McCall. And that's what he did. He kept getting the press and politicians and keep putting pressure on what happened in Groveland, in Lake County. And in right before the retrial, the Ku Klux Klan put a bomb underneath Harry Moore's house, killing him and his wife. They were basically the first martyrs of the modern civil rights movement. And believe it or not, they're not very well known. And it is striking to me. I think it's a thing about Florida. And I write about it in the book. It's considered like south of the South. People didn't look at Florida as being part of the Cotton Belt civil rights South. These atrocities we had in Florida, you had like Emmett Till type stories that happened before Emmett Till, and nobody knows about them. And I think it's because Florida was just off the radar. People didn't know what to think of it. They didn't see it as a civil rights issue. They just saw it as, this violence, but it wasn't looped in with the civil rights movement. And strangely, a lot of these stories in Florida just got lost because of Florida's, they thought of it as, well, later on you had a progressive governor sort of by the name of Leroy Collins, and it wasn't a typical Alabama, Louisiana South. They didn't really know what to think about it. Miami and beaches, it wasn't considered part of the South. Unusually, this the second trial went forward. They allowed Walter Irvin, who you can see in the center there, to heal from his wounds, and he stood trial again 3 weeks later. At that point, the governor stepped in, Leroy Collins. He knew this case was getting out of control. It was really bad publicity. There was tourism boycotts, citrus boycotts, and the governor sent a deal down to Thurgood Marshall and said, "Tell Walter Irvin to plead guilty. We'll just give him prison, and then when this blows over, we can correct this." And Marshall thought that was the greatest idea he'd ever heard, because it wasn't normal to get a deal like that in the South. And Marshall had done so many dangerous cases and lost so many clients to the electric chair that he urged Walter Irvin to take the deal, but Irvin would not take it. And he basically said, "I'm not going to lie. I'm not going to lie in court. I had nothing to do with this." And he said, "You're Thurgood Marshall. You just got this overturned in the Supreme Court. You can save me." And Marshall's like, "I don't think I can." And he was trying to be honest with him. But true to his word, Walter Irvin was convicted and sentenced to death again, until Governor Collins basically commuted the death sentence, and Walter Irvin would spend the next 20 years in prison for a crime that he did not commit. Thurgood Marshall went around and raised money for the NAACP talking about this Groveland case, and they didn't really need it anymore because the case was kind of done. And so I think they raised over $100,000. All of it got basically pushed over to Brown, the cases that were becoming Brown versus Board. And so suddenly Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP had a war chest of funds that they were able to use for the Brown versus Board case and for that brief, which is one of the most impressive civil rights documents ever put together. And that was because Marshall was able to bring in lawyers, historians, sociologists, and really make a really powerful case that could only really be done with the resources like that. You know, I'll just fast forward a little bit. My book came out and people started reading it, and there was it was being read in the legislature. And I remember getting a call saying that, we think that the state of Florida is going to act on this with a claims bill to get justice for the Groveland boys posthumously. And so in 2019, they passed a claims bill unanimously, officially apologizing to the families of the Groveland Four, and basically calling on the governor to pardon the Groveland Four. And in 2019, they had a hearing, and this is actually Norma Paget, who, it's hard to think of these cases sometimes. They seem like they're ancient history. But many people are, well, not many, but several people are still alive from this case. And Norma Paget was one of them. And they brought her to the hearing, and she basically stuck to her story and said she was against pardons. And she spoke, and several of the family members spoke. And I ended up speaking myself and basically talked about the importance of this not being any kind of he said, she said case. This is really, pardons should be considered because of what happened in that courtroom and what I've documented in my book, all the prosecutorial misconduct, the known perjury, the manufacturing of evidence. What happened in the courtroom is the reason that you want to get some kind of post-conviction relief, even though it's posthumous, for the Groveland Four. And so just like the legislature and the Florida Senate, which was unanimous in recommending pardons and apologies, the clemency board voted 4-0 right there on the spot to officially pardon the Groveland Four. And you can see here, they had a monument dedication in front of the Lake County Courthouse. You could see Governor DeSantis. Governor DeSantis, in the lead up to the election in 2018, said that he was going to pay attention to this Groveland case as one of the first matters that he took on. And true to his words, I think it was the third day that he was in office, he held that clemency meeting for the Groveland Four. And it came as a shocker to many of us who were there. It was just I think it was really a great moment in government. But something really interesting happened, and this is at the Lake County Courthouse. The families were very gracious about this, but they also felt that a pardon is something you can give a guilty person, a forgiveness. And they insisted on their innocence, and they wanted full exonerations. And so what happened is the Florida Attorney General reopened the case, and they tasked the Florida Department of Law Enforcement to reinvestigate. And I had two agents show up to my office in New York, and I gave them all my files, and I sort of went through the case with them, and they spent, I think, good almost 2 years investigating this, and it ended up, their report ended up on the desk of the state attorney in Lake County, Bill Gladson. And I remember he got it, and he had to tell the families that there was no real path towards posthumous exonerations in the state of Florida. Couldn't figure out a way to do it. He said the only way to do it is to come up with some new evidence, and he didn't think that was something that was going to be possible, because so much time had passed, and how do you do that? And he knew that I had tried to do as much as I could with this. And so he called me up, and we started talking about this, and I said, well, something did happen. I got a letter in 2019 after the pardons from the grandson of the state attorney, Jesse Hunter, who tried the Groveland boy. And this grandson told me in an email that it was common knowledge within the families of both the prosecutor and the judge that the Groveland boys were innocent, and that they went ahead with the prosecution anyway. And he said, I've seen this documented in correspondence. And so the state attorney went and interviewed him the next day, got all the information from him, and he began to get a little encouraged. And then he decided that he was going to try and find the evidence from the trial, which I was told was no longer around. Couldn't find it. I spent years trying to find it. It never turned up. I just assumed it was stolen or missing. But this state attorney, Bill Gladson, actually physically went into some of these evidence rooms in various courtrooms in Central Florida looking for evidence. And there you can see State Attorney Bill Gladson. And he was absolutely determined. And he told me he just did not want to go back to those families and tell them that nothing could be done. And he felt like it deserved an extra effort. And that was what was guiding him. And he'd read the reports, he'd read my book, and he was convinced that he knew what the right thing to do was, but he was trying to find a way to do this. And new evidence was his past. And this was Jesse Hunter, the man who had written those letters. And one of the letters that this man wrote, which I thought was really interesting, was he wrote a letter to Leroy Collins in 1954. And he basically admitted that he didn't think that the convictions were solid. And he thought, he expressed that in a letter, that he had remorse about it and second thoughts about the guilt of the defendants. And he wrote that letter, and Leroy Collins used that letter as a major piece in order to commute the death sentence of Walter Irvin. And so this, old Southern attorney had a change of heart. And interestingly enough, he credited Thurgood Marshall with that change of heart, which I just thought was extraordinary. He was definitely like, his health was failing, and I believe he really wanted to do the right thing. And that letter was something that I've never really seen anything like that in the Jim Crow South. Somebody really putting themselves on the line and saying, we got this wrong at this time in history. Getting back to the state attorney, Bill Gladson, sure enough, in one of the courthouse evidence rooms, he found the original trial evidence. It was mislabeled. It was in a different case, and they opened it up, and he was able to find the pants of Walter Irvin, which were used in the original trials, held up. And the state attorney, Jesse Hunter, at the time, pointed to a stain on the pants. And he said, this was tested, and this was proof positive of semen from the defendant. And it's obvious. And that was one of the things one of the pieces of evidence that we used in the conviction. Bill Gladson decided to have that stain tested the next day by the Florida Department of Law Enforcement with DNA. And they were able to determine that was not a human stain. And so at that point, State Attorney Gladson said that is new evidence. That shows that the state used manufactured evidence and misled the jury. And he decided that he could make up a motion and write it. And he wrote this motion. It's again, one of the most impressive civil rights documents that I've ever read. He just did a phenomenal job of just describing the case. His language was just unforgiving about his predecessors and the injustice that they committed, this knowing injustice toward the Groveland boys. And so he was able to write up a motion to dismiss the indictments of each member of the Groveland Four. And it was in order to correct the record with newly discovered evidence. And it got labeled, it wasn't really an official exoneration. Can't call it an exoneration, but in a sense, it is an exoneration. And so the families were absolutely thrilled with this. All of us showed up in court in November of last year in Lake County, in the Lake County courthouse, and State Attorney Gladson argued the case, and the judge, Heidi Davis, said something along the lines, "It is my extreme honor to correct this grave injustice and to formally dismiss these indictments and to clear the names of these Groveland 4 defendants." And you can see the family members, their reaction there was extraordinarily emotional. Many of them had waited more than 70 years for this day to see their family members' fathers' names cleared. I actually brought down Thurgood Marshall Jr. to share in the day and at the press conference. And Thurgood Marshall Jr. talked about how these defendants and their families were heroes to his father, how he would talk about them in this case and talk about the extreme courage of the attorneys that would, argue and stay in Florida to fight this and the risk that they faced doing this. And it really meant a great deal to the families to be able to have Thurgood Marshall there to share in that day. And there you can see New York Times coverage of this. It was covered around the world, finally exonerated 72 years later, and sort of a postscript to this story. And I do call it a great moment in Florida government, but I also like to remind people that, Florida's got the worst record of any state for wrongful convictions. Since the Supreme Court reinstated the death penalty back in 1976, the state of Florida has executed 99 people. They've also had to exonerate 30 people on death row, completely exonerated by DNA, proven innocent. So that for every 3 people who are executed in Florida, 1 person is wrongfully convicted and exonerated. That's just a horrible, horrible record. But I do give a great credit for the state and just the energy and the commitment to recognizing the need to sort of address these wrongful convictions and these injustices, because this is the state of Florida's criminal justice system. And in order to have accountability and in order to have some credibility, you have to address the injustices of the past. And it's a very difficult thing to do to get post-conviction relief in the state of Florida, as I'm sure many of you know. And so especially posthumously. So this really sent a message, a very powerful message, I think, to the rest of the country to say this can be done. And it can be done in a bipartisan way. This doesn't have to be, right versus left. It can be right versus wrong. And I think that's the spirit that Thurgood Marshall argued. And it's definitely been the spirit of the way I've written this book and talk about this case. I don't really like to go down those political lanes. I think that this is an issue that everybody can agree on, and it's stronger that way. And it's always a message that I've tried to carry when I talk about this case. So at this point, I will turn it over for questions, and it would be great to hear from you. I always get excellent questions. One of the things I did want to say before I talk is that I don't remember if people are familiar with FADP.org, but the Floridians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty, they're working with an alliance with mental health and other organizations to pass legislation in 2023 that would protect people with serious mental illness from the death penalty in Florida. And this is a book I've written about, a subject I've written about in my book, Beneath the Ruthless Sun. And thankfully, we have really committed and talented people at the FADPs. And if you want to look at more about that, you can go to their website. It's fadp.org. And really powerful work that they're doing. So I will open it up today to anybody else who has questions.
Hi, I'm back.
Hello.
Thank you very much. Do you want to turn off your screen share? And then there you go, now you're big. Okay. So we have what happened to the underage defendant sentenced to life?
It's interesting. What happened to him was he got served, he served prison in Belgrade 10 years. And after the 8th year, he just walked out of prison. he was like under light guard, I guess. And he just got a job up in Jacksonville for 6 months. And there was some kind of mix up about his freedom. And they rearrested him, said, technically you're an escapee. But then they looked at his record and they saw what had happened and they just said, you're free to go. And they let him go. He became a successful businessman in Tennessee, raised a very big family. And never really talked about this case because he didn't know anything about it. He was actually picked up for loitering in another town. He was sleeping at a train depot waiting to do citrus picking work. And he was picked up. He was actually in another jail for the night. But because that they needed 4 defendants, he got swept into it. So he had no idea who these other defendants were. He didn't know anything about it. But it was just, he was beaten, viciously in the courthouse, under the courthouse in the basement. And basically railroaded. But he did survive, and he only passed away in 1992. So he had a full life. He was the only Groveland boy to really live that long.
In what way does white supremacy function throughout today's legal system?
Oh,
especially in Florida. Quick, easy question.
Yeah, it's still there. One of the things I often talk about, when this book came out, it was like February of 2012, maybe March of 2012. Trayvon Martin had just been killed. And so I came down to Florida to talk about my book, and that's what everyone was asking me. And one of the things that they asked, people said, like, nothing's changed. This is the same thing. Nothing's changed. And I understand the frustration, definitely there. But one of the things I like to point out is that if you read Devil in the Grove, you can see that the criminal justice system does not nearly resemble what it does today. If you look back in the 1940s and see what's happening, prosecutors just committed prosecutorial misconduct. It was just very easy to get your way in a courtroom, and the responsibility of the jury was to just go along with the prosecutor, go along with the state and the sheriff. That was that was your team. And this societal expectation of just white people getting together and basically doing what they're told. Lynching sort of started to die out after World War II. The public didn't have a taste for it anymore, and people didn't want to see it anymore. And so what you saw happening was legal lynching, basically executions by law, young men sent to the death penalty for the same crimes that they were formerly being lynched for. And so this mass incarceration and this move to the death penalty to punish these social injustices, whistling at a white woman. I mean, these weren't homicides. These were like sexual accusations that you could be eligible for the death penalty, and people were being executed for these kind of accusations. And so that is how really white supremacy leaks its way in. If you look back at the end of slavery, Reconstruction, you start seeing the building of the mass incarceration in America. This, all of a sudden the prison labor, debt peonage, all these things start to make up for the lost labor. It became an incarceration thing, and this all worked. If you can see it, the way it just sort of mutates. It became regular labor in the citrus groves, but there were laws on the books at the time called work or fight laws, and it basically enabled the sheriff to drive around town, and if you were not in the military, if you were an able-bodied male and you were not in the military and you were not working that day, you could be picked up on a work or fight law, a vagrancy law, thrown into jail, and basically become a debt slave. You would, they would say, you got a serious fine of $50. You have to work that off in the citrus fields or citrus groves for some of these wealthy white owners. And it became a bail bond racket. And so the sheriffs were just leasing out their prisoners to do picking for free labor. And this was legal. And the most bizarre thing about it was the sheriff himself got to keep the money personally from the fines. So he was totally incentivized to go out and do this. And he was able to keep up to $7,500 in this kind of prison labor money that went right to his land, his houses, his cars. He could do whatever. And this was on the books into the 50s. So, that's what white supremacy looks like too. It's not just lynchings. There's all these measures that you can stomp on African Americans in these communities by law.
Someone is asking, is there still a jury instruction to trust the testimony of a cop or that of a person being arrested?
I think juries are more sophisticated now. And you see these kind of things. You see lists. A lot of state attorneys have lists of cops that they do not want in any cases testifying on anything because of their past. They have a known past of having committed perjury. But back in the day, I mean, you look at these arguments where a Black man is on trial for his life, and if there was any kind of aggressive defense, which there usually was not, they usually had court-appointed lawyers who were white men who were business lawyers in the community, and they didn't want to really rattle this too much or push too aggressively. So they become basically like two lampposts in a trial. But the expectations on the jury members, you would have prosecutors saying, do you honestly think that this fine standing deputy that we all know from all our barbecues and outings is going to risk his career to lie about something like this, about one Black person committing a black? It's not, and that was the way it was presented. And that still happens today. But I think, jurors are a little more sophisticated about it. They see television, they've seen things on their cell phones, of police brutality, and they don't always trust the state to get it right. But I don't know if there's any, maybe somebody knows the answer. I don't know if there's a jury instruction about that.
Now, I want to respect your time. It is 7:30, and we would love to have you back for part 2 if you're interested. We have availability in July and after, but I won't put you on the spot. But
I can go on all day. So,
well, let me ask you one last question. You may not want to answer this. It's an opinion question, and it is political in nature. But they're asking, given the history of racism in Florida, why is the governor trying to erase this history? And I'm assuming that's a reference to the policies about what can be taught in schools.
Yeah, and there's part of me that thinks, we're talking about critical race theory, and I think there's a lot of it that's political theater, but I'm also nervous about it because there are books that are being banned, and you can see this sort of vague bill that's been written to sort of, push this along. I don't like it at all. I mean, I just find it like, to me, it's like, this is how you learn from the past, and you have to address these things. And I think, I have a lot of people telling me, and there's op-eds, that this Devil in the Grove needs to be taught in schools. We need to know about this. And it's interesting because, To Kill a Mockingbird is like one of the most widely read novels that touches along these same lines that I'm writing about, the Jim Crow South and these false accusations of sexual assault. But to me, this was never a story about sexual assault. This is a story about economics. It's about keeping people down. And that's what I think when you read the book, you really quickly realize that this is an invented charge. This is about something greater. And it's really about, propping up white supremacy. And, why is it that a book that's real and truthful is something that can't be taught, but we can read a novel about it? And I recognize that it's more, it's a brutal book to read. I mean, I've been told by this. I mean, I remember I was reading an interview by Justice Stevens a couple of years ago, and he talked about his reading. He said, "What book made you the angriest in your lifetime that you read?" And he said, "Devil in the Grove." And it's interesting to me because I get that all the time. This book makes people angry. And when the other thing that people say to me is, "I cannot believe this was happening in America, and I cannot believe I didn't know about it." Those are the most important comments that anyone ever says to me. And I think that these kind of stories are really important to know. And then when you look at the whole story, how government was able to look at this, a fresh look at it and say, this is wrong. We have to do something. It only demonstrates the power of storytelling, but it also demonstrates the power of attorneys. I think lawyers are the unsung heroes of the civil rights movement, because before there were protests and Martin Luther King came along, they had to sue for the right to protest. And that was the NAACP's lawyers. And what they were accomplishing in the courts before we got to the stage of protest was really important. And they went hand in hand. They had to be handed off to him. And I think Thurgood Marshall recognized that eventually, like, the law can only go so far. And that's where Martin Luther King picked up. And so politically, obviously I am against, any kind of book banning or any kind of not learning about this history, because it's uncomfortable. Americans should be uncomfortable. We can handle it. Germany teaches everybody about their history. In South Africa, there's committees to just reconstruct the past and to make sure it never happens again and to acknowledge the truth. And in America, we've never really done that. And we should learn from Germany and South Africa, because that's how you move on from this kind of past.
Right. All right. Well, thank you. There are many more questions, but again, we're over our time, and I don't want to abuse you. But there are many, many, many positive. I think you can see the comments. People
Yes.
are very grateful and very moved, and everything you've shared is very informative. It sounds like everybody has learned something. People do want to know, has there ever been a corrupt white supremacist official that actually got some comeuppance or some, punished for their actions in that case? But
yeah, I'll just say very quickly that no, Sheriff Willis McCall used to brag that he was investigated 49 times on civil rights violations, and he beat every one of them. And so he never was held accountable. In fact, I'll just tell you one brief last thing. Sometimes people ask me about this. Sheriff McCall served 28 years as sheriff. After he shot the Groveland boys on the side of that road, people were asking him, like, do you think that's going to affect your election chances? And he was like laughing. He said, yeah, that'll get me 6 more elections. And he was wrong. It was 7 more. It wasn't until he killed someone in a prison, a young black man, mentally disabled black man with witnesses, that he was suspended from office by Governor Reuben Askew. And that was his downfall. But he was acquitted. When they charged him with murder, he was acquitted.
okay, now we will all go and seethe and rage. So, okay. Well, everyone, thank you so much. This was so informative and so important. And everyone, you can turn on your cameras and unmute yourselves and show your appreciation.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure.
Thanks.
Great comments, and I hope I see some of you again.
Awesome.
And we had an excellent turnout. At one point, there were 117 people here, and there were more people coming and going. So very big turnout. So,
Thank you so much. For the wonderful
Awesome.
presentation. Yeah, an honor.
Thank you,
an honor.
Mr. King. Thank you very much.
please
Yes.
come back. Please
Oh,
come
I
back.
will, definitely.
I just recently
Thank you.
gave your book to a state attorney here in Volusia County, Florida. She was so pleased.
Oh, that's so great to hear. I love those kind of stories.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
I'm
Lisa.
reading
You
it
are
right
quite
now.
welcome.
Oh, great. It's a dark book, but I think there's a lot to learn, and
There's a
I
lot to
didn't spoil
learn.
it.
History repeats itself if you don't learn something.
Yep. I highly recommend this book.
Absolutely.
So
I
much.
can't put it down.
Well, I've had many people tell me they got so mad that they'd thrown the book across the room while they were reading it.
yeah. Couple of
Yeah,
times.
well.
Hope it wasn't
Hey.
a Kindle.
I also recommend your other book, the Beneath the Ruthless Sun. It's a wonderful, wonderful book.
I bet
No,
it
it's
is.
And it's another one I want to throw across the room.
Yeah, it's got some of the same people in it. Sadly.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, I really appreciate all your beautiful comments. I'm reading them, and just thank you so much for listening. And
You're quite welcome.
I'm so honored to be here.
Thank you. We appreciate
I
you
think
very much.
we're honored by you.
Yes,
This is
sir.
interesting. Yeah, wonderful. And
Yeah.
sad too. That's a very sad story to share.
Yes, I know.
Break my heart every single moment.
Wow, you guys are great.
Thank you to the host as well.
Yes,
Yes.
and God bless all those families of the Groveland boys.
Exactly.
Yep. They finally got some justice after all those years. Oh my
They
God.
really did. It's about the best they could do with it, but
It
at
is.
least their names were cleared.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's what's important.
Mm,
They're martyrs. Thank you so much.
you're most welcome. Thank you.
Thank you and good evening.
Good night.
Good
All
night.
right, thank you.
Good night.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. About the transcript that my
Yes.
laptop was able to capture it, but I don't know how to get it. It's a mystery for me.
Well, there will be a recording of the whole thing
Good.
Yeah.
that will
And-
be that will be sent out to everyone who registered.
Oh, okay,
Woo!
perfect, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Appreciate
And
it.
We can hear Gilbert King in our sleep.
yes, yes, and we do this every month, so please come back.
Oh, do you? Awesome.
This is this is the first event of the second year that we've been
Very
doing this.
good.
We don't have
Thank you.
Gilbert King every month, but you know.
Oh, you're with the Volusia Flagler Chapter. Awesome.
Yeah, I need to.
I would like to share the recording with my local chapter of the Democratic Party and here in St. John's, if that's okay.
Awesome.
And it'll be available online too. So whenever you get the link, you can share it
Thank
however
you.
you.
Certainly
however
Do
you-
you know how long will it take you to send the link? With
It
that
won't be long.
recording?
Well, yeah, I don't send the link myself. I send the file to the affiliate and they do it for me. So it depends on what their scheduling is, but it should be pretty quick turnaround.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, thank you.
All righty.
All right.
Thanks again.
Well, thanks
Thank
again for
you.
organizing this. Appreciate it.
We
Of course,
really
thanks
do.
for being
And
here.
Great.
another, very sad story of social injustice.
It's
You
okay.
know, breaks my heart. Yeah, totally. But needs to be
We're gonna get there.
shared to.
We
you know,
have
to
an
make us-
associate justice now, Katanji Brown Jackson. We're making progress. It takes time. Progress takes time.
Yes. Yeah.
People don't want to change, but we have to change. So it's okay.
He has a Florida connection.
That's a good thing.
All right, friends.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye
All right,
now.
bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
all.
Thanks. Pleasure meeting everybody.
That's the deal.